At the heart of the Roman Empire, while Julius Caesar conquered Gaul and Pompey expanded the eastern borders, a man of immeasurable ambition and wealth was carving his own path to glory. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and his fate would be marked by one of the most ironic and terrible deaths ever recorded in history. To understand this tragic end, we must return to ancient Rome, where wealth and power went hand in hand, and where one man's greed would lead him to meet his end in a manner almost poetic in its cruelty. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born into a Roman aristocratic family around 115 BCE. From an early age, he demonstrated an extraordinary talent for business and an insatiable thirst for wealth. While other young Romans dreamed of military glory, Crassus focused on a different war, the battle for the accumulation of property, gold, and political influence. His golden opportunity came during Sulla's proscriptions, when the Roman dictator published lists of political enemies whose assets would be confiscated. Crassus saw not a tragedy, but a business opportunity. He purchased properties from proscribed victims at ridiculously low prices, taking advantage of families who were risking their lives. Properties worth fortunes were acquired for a fraction of their value. But Crassus's masterpiece came with his most infamous entrepreneurial innovation, Rome's first fire brigade. In a city built primarily of wood, where fires were common and devastating, Crassus organized a group of 500 slaves trained to combat fire. Sounds noble, doesn't it? The perversion lay in the method. When a property caught fire, his men would quickly arrive at the scene. Instead of immediately fighting the flames, Crassus would offer to buy the burning building at an absurdly low price. If the desperate owner accepted the offer, his men would act to save the structure. If they refused, they would simply watch as everything turned to ashes. In a few years, Crassus became the owner of a large part of Rome. His fortune was estimated at 200 million sesterces, the equivalent of billions of dollars today, making him possibly the richest man in Roman history. No Roman should be considered wealthy, he said, if he cannot maintain an army with his own resources. Despite all his wealth, Crassus suffered from an incurable ailment, comparison. While he accumulated properties and gold, his contemporaries were accumulating something he secretly envied much more: military glory. Pompey the Great had conquered provinces and received triumphs. Julius Caesar was gaining renown for his campaigns in Gaul. Crassus, although he had played an important role in suppressing Spartacus's revolt, had never achieved the military prestige of his political rivals. This dissatisfaction corroded his soul, like rust corrodes precious metal. He had conquered all the wealth a man could desire, but Rome's true currency was not gold, it was military glory. And so at 60 years of age, when most men seek comfort and tranquility, Crassus embarked on a military campaign that would change his destiny forever. The target of his late ambition was the Parthian Empire, an eastern power that controlled territories corresponding to today's Iran and Iraq. The Parthians were known for their wealth, but primarily for their mounted warriors, the cataphracts and horse archers, capable of shooting their arrows while riding away from the enemy. The famous Parthian shot, which gave us the modern expression, parting shot. For Crassus, Parthia represented a dual opportunity: to conquer military glory that would rival Caesar's and Pompey's, and to further increase his already vast fortune. It was said that Parthian gold was so abundant that their cities gleamed in the sun. These stories inflamed Crassus's imagination, fueling his obsession. In 53 BCE, ignoring all negative omens and even Rome's official religious opposition, Crassus marched eastward with 7 legions, approximately 40,000 men. The expedition was under the sign of misfortune from the beginning. During the departure ritual, instead of the traditional prayer asking for a victorious return, the priest made a terrible mistake, invoking curses upon Crassus. When his troops crossed the Euphrates River, a violent storm destroyed the bridge, killing many soldiers, another ominous sign that Crassus chose to ignore. As they advanced into Parthian territory, Crassus's overconfidence became increasingly evident. He refused strategic alliances that would have aided the campaign. He rejected sensible military advice from his officers. His son Publius, a talented commander who had served under Caesar, tried in vain to contain his father's recklessness. Meanwhile, the Parthians, led by General Serena, observed and planned. Serena was as remarkable as his adversary. Young, a brilliant strategist, and with impressive resources of his own, he traveled with 1,000 camels to transport his baggage, 200 carriages for his concubines, 1,000 heavily armored soldiers, and 10,000 mounted archers. The fate of the two men would intersect in the plains near Kerhe, in present-day Turkey. As the Roman legions marched under the scorching sun of Mesopotamia, Crassus's scouts reported the proximity of Parthian forces. Against advice to form a defensive line near the river, Crassus ordered an immediate advance. His haste to achieve glory and gold would be his undoing. What followed was one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. The Parthians used an innovative tactic. Their mounted archers would attack, fire a barrage of arrows, and retreat before the Romans could counterattack. The legions, famous for their discipline and compact formation, became easy targets on the flat, open terrain. The Parthian arrows, capable of penetrating armor, caused devastating casualties. Desperate to break the siege, Publius, Crassus's son, led a cavalry force in an attack against the archers. It was a fatal move. Drawn away from the main body of the army, Publius and his men were surrounded. After a fierce struggle, Publius, wounded and seeing the battle was lost, asked his shield-bearer to kill him to avoid capture. The Parthians cut off his head and mounted it on a spear. When messengers reached Crassus bearing his son's head, the psychological blow was devastating. The man who had accumulated so much wealth now faced a loss that no gold could compensate. With his army in disarray and surrounded, Crassus had no choice but to attempt to negotiate with Serena. Here, historical narratives diverge, and the line between fact and legend becomes thin. According to Roman accounts, Crassus went to negotiate with the Parthian general. During the meeting, a fight broke out. Some say the Parthians tried to capture Crassus by force, others that there was a misunderstanding. In the ensuing chaos, Crassus was killed. What happened next transformed into the legend that echoes through the centuries. The Parthians, knowing Crassus's obsession with gold, decided to give him one final lesson. According to Dio Cassius and Plutarch, Roman historians who wrote decades later, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, proclaiming, "You have thirsted for gold, now drink gold." The image is powerfully symbolic. The man whose life was dedicated to the accumulation of wealth, killed by the very metal he so coveted. The irony of the punishment, if it occurred, would not have been lost on the Romans, who often saw in great tragedies moral lessons about hubris and uncontrolled ambition. But here, we need to pause and question, did this terrible end really happen, or is it a later elaboration, a poetic death, invented to fit the character of the man? Historical truth, as frequently occurs with events so distant, is complex. There are reasons to doubt the molten gold story. First, the most detailed accounts come from authors who wrote long after the event. Plutarch wrote his biography of Crassus almost 200 years after his death. Dio Cassius wrote even later. Neither had access to eyewitnesses. Moreover, similar executions appear in other historical contexts. The Persian king Cyrus supposedly executed Croesus of Lydia, another ruler notorious for his wealth, in a similar manner. Stories about greedy monarchs or generals punished with molten gold appear in various cultures, suggesting a possible recurring folkloric theme rather than a specific historical event. Modern historians suggest it is more likely that Crassus was simply killed during the negotiations, perhaps beheaded, as was Parthian custom with important enemies. His head would have been sent to the Parthian king Orodes II, who, according to some sources, was watching a play by Euripides when the macabre trophy arrived. If the molten gold story is apocryphal, why has it persisted? Probably because it provides a perfect narrative conclusion to Crassus's life. The Romans adored such poetic symmetries, especially when they reinforced moral values. Crassus's death, true or not, served as a powerful parable about the dangers of excessive greed. The consequences of Crassus's disastrous campaign were profound. Rome lost approximately 20,000 men killed and 10,000 captured, who were settled by the Parthians on the eastern frontier of their empire. The legionary eagles, sacred symbols of the Roman legions, were captured, a humiliation that would haunt Rome for decades until Augustus negotiated their return. Politically, Crassus's death removed the third pillar of the so-called First Triumvirate. Without Crassus to mediate between them, Caesar and Pompey would soon face each other in a devastating civil war that would forever change the face of the Roman Republic. As for the Parthians, their victory at Carrhae gave them a reputation for invincibility that would last for centuries. No Roman general would achieve a decisive victory against them until Trajan, almost 170 years later. Crassus's story offers powerful reflections on ambition, hubris, and the limits of money's power. He had everything wealth could buy but died seeking something gold could not provide: immortal glory. Ironically, he achieved immortality, not as the conqueror he wished to be, but as an eternal symbol of the dangers of limitless greed. If the legend of his death by molten gold is true, it represents a form of poetic justice so perfect that it almost seems invented. If it is apocryphal, the fact that so many generations believed it true reveals something about our own need to see moral order in the chaos of history, to believe that in the end, we are punished precisely for our deepest sins. Reflecting on the life and death of Marcus Licinius Crassus, we are reminded that all the riches in the world are powerless against fate. The man who owned almost all of Rome could not buy his survival in the arid plains of Mesopotamia. And so, the richest of Romans entered history not for his financial achievements, but for the manner in which he died, with the bitter taste of molten gold in his mouth. Historical truth or moralizing legend, the image remains as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unbridled ambition and the insatiable quest for more, always more. In ancient Rome, it was said that every man had his price. Crassus, who knew the price of everything, discovered too late the value of things money cannot buy: wisdom, moderation, and in the end, a death with dignity. Picture this. A girl's scream pierces the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle on a winter night in 1457 AD, cutting through the howling wind like a blade through silk. In a chamber lit only by flickering candles, 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort grips blood-soaked sheets, her small body convulsing with pain no child should endure. Midwives whisper Latin prayers, their faces grave in the dancing shadows. Outside, Snow blankets the frozen ground of Bedfordshire, but inside, a future king of England is being torn from a girl barely past childhood. Margaret's auburn hair clings to her sweat-drenched face as agony crashes over her. They think she is dying. The baby is too large, her hips too narrow, her body, at 13, is not yet fully grown. Yet here she labors to bring forth the son who will one day sit upon the throne as Henry VII. The irony is lost on no one present. This child, born of such suffering, will end the bloodiest conflict in English history and found the Tudor dynasty that will reshape the world. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. A child in a savage world. The girl writhing in that bed was no ordinary noble maiden. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried the blood of kings, specifically that of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. But royal blood, as Margaret would learn throughout her extraordinary life, could be both a blessing and a curse in the savage political landscape of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses would soon tear the realm apart. Such bloodlines made you either a valuable pawn or a dangerous threat. Margaret's path to that birthing chamber began years earlier, when she was a child playing in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. Born around May 1443 to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where alliances shifted like sand, and marriage was the ultimate weapon of statecraft. Her father died when she was barely a year old, some say, by his own hand after military defeats in France left him broken and disgraced. Others whispered of poison, for in those days, whispers of poison followed every noble's unexpected death, like vultures trailing an army. The circumstances of John Beaufort's death haunted Margaret's early years. He had commanded English forces in France during the final phases of the 100 Years' War, watching helplessly as territories won by Henry V slipped away. The military disasters ate at him like a cancer. When he returned to England in 1444, courtiers noted his hollow eyes and trembling hands. He spoke little, ate less, and spent hours staring at nothing. On May 27, 1444, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was fever, but those closest to him knew better. Whether by blade, poison, or the weight of failure, John Beaufort had chosen death over dishonor. Margaret's mother wasted no time securing her daughter's future. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Beauchamp understood the rules of survival in a world where women and children were only as valuable as the alliances they could cement. By age 6, little Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The contract bound two of England's most powerful families in an alliance that seemed unbreakable. But politics moved faster than childhood, and when Suffolk fell from grace and was murdered while crossing the English Channel in 1450, that betrothal became worthless paper. Suffolk's crime had been negotiating the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou, and the surrender of Maine and Anjou to France, terms that enraged the English nobility and commoners alike. His death was brutal, even by the standards of the time. Dragged from his ship by pirates or political enemies, he was forced to kneel on the gunwale while one of his captors struck off his head with a rusty sword, requiring half a dozen clumsy blows. A marriage of politics and pain. The Beaufort women learned early that survival meant adaptability. Margaret's next betrothal came swiftly to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI, through his mother's marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts with questionable legitimacy, but they had the king's favor. Owen Tudor, a court official, had caught the eye of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow. Their secret marriage scandalized the nobility, but produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom Henry VI recognized and elevated to the peerage. In 1455, when Margaret was approximately 12 years old, she married Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that sealed political alliances with words of love she barely understood and vows that would bind her to a destiny beyond imagining. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, the same stronghold where Margaret had spent her childhood. The great hall was adorned with tapestries depicting the deeds of her Beaufort ancestors, while the chapel where they exchanged vows contained the tomb of her grandfather, John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. Edmund Tudor was a man in his 20s, seasoned by war and politics. Margaret was still growing out of her childhood clothes. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity in an age when noble girls were treated as broodmares for dynastic ambitions. The wedding night was a trauma Margaret never spoke of in later life, but its impact was written in her body's permanent damage and her lifelong religious devotion that bordered on obsession. Within months, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her young mind. The older women around her spoke in hushed tones about her condition, their faces mixing joy for a potential heir with concern for such a young mother. Margaret's own mother watched her daughter's growing belly with deep anxiety. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, old enough to survive childbirth safely. At 12, soon to be 13, Margaret was attempting something that had killed countless women older and stronger than herself. A widow at 13. Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances of his capture and death remain murky, wrapped in the fog of civil war and political intrigue. Some accounts suggest he was taken during a surprise attack, while his forces were scattered across South Wales. Others hint at betrayal from within his ranks. Whether he died of plague in prison or was murdered by his captors remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. The plague explanation was convenient for his captors. Disease was common in medieval prisons, and claiming natural death avoided charges of murdering a royal half-brother. But contemporary chronicles noted the suspicious speed of his decline and the refusal of his captors to allow physicians to attend him. By November 1456, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world about to explode into civil war. The news of Edmund's death reached Margaret at Lamphy Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had been staying while her husband campaigned. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked November evening, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride across Wales. Margaret was in the palace chapel, praying for her husband's safe return. When the messenger's boots echoed on the stone floor behind her, she knew before he spoke that her world had shattered. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law. The decision was both chivalrous and practical. Margaret carried the potential heir to the Tudor line, a child who might continue their family's royal connection. He brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where massive stone walls offered protection from the growing chaos outside. Pembroke was a fortress on the edge of the world, perched on cliffs above Milford Haven, where Atlantic waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. Here, in this remote Welsh castle, Margaret would endure the most harrowing experience of her young life: the ordeal of childbirth. The journey to Pembroke in her advanced pregnancy was an ordeal in itself. Winter roads were barely passable, rutted with frozen mud and blocked by fallen trees. Margaret traveled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt sending pain through her swollen body. The journey, which should have taken 2 days, stretched to 5 as they navigated flooded rivers and avoided bands of armed men whose loyalties were unknown. Pembroke Castle in winter was a harsh refuge, built on a limestone outcrop above the Pembroke River. Its great round keep, nearly 80 feet high, had withstood sieges and storms for 3 centuries. But comfort was not its purpose, survival was. The castle's chambers were cold and drafty, warmed only by fireplaces that devoured wood faster than servants could supply it. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind whistling through cracks in the ancient stones. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was brutal. Ice formed on the inside of the castle windows, and the sea wind howled through every crevice. Margaret, her belly swollen with child, could barely walk the length of her chamber without exhausting herself. Her body, still that of a child in many ways, struggled under the burden it carried. The castle's physician, Dr. Louis Carleon, examined her with growing alarm. Her hips were too narrow, he confided to Jasper Tudor. The child was positioned badly, and birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Carleon, a learned man who had studied at Oxford and Paris, had delivered children to queens and peasants alike. He had read Hippocrates and Galen, attended lectures by the greatest medical minds of his generation, and accumulated 40 years of experience. But as he examined the pregnant child, all his learning seemed inadequate. Margaret's pelvis had not fully developed. She was still growing. The baby was large, positioned wrong, and showed signs of distress. Carleon confided his fears to Jasper in a private meeting in the castle's solar, as snow swirled outside the arrow-slit windows. He had seen this situation before, and it rarely ended well for mother or child. They could attempt to turn the baby, but that might kill both immediately. They could wait, hoping nature would correct the position, but delay increased the risk of the child's death and Margaret's exhaustion. Or they could attempt a cesarean birth, a procedure almost invariably fatal to the mother. Jasper, barely 25 himself, faced the terrible burden of deciding his sister-in-law's fate. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would end with him. If she lived but lost the child, the same result would follow. A child's suffering, a dynasty's birth. On that January night in 1457, Margaret's labor began with pains that doubled her over. She had been walking the castle battlements, taking the exercise Dr. Carleon insisted was necessary. When the first contraction struck, the pain was unlike anything she had experienced, a crushing, tearing sensation that seemed to split her body in half. She collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping, as her attendants rushed her back to her chambers. The midwives, experienced women who had delivered countless babies, exchanged glances heavy with meaning. They had seen this before, a child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond its limits by human ambition and political necessity. They prepared their instruments and said their prayers, knowing that before dawn, one or both of their patients might be dead. Dame Gwennian Firk Davith, the head midwife, had been delivering babies for 30 years, learning her craft from her mother and grandmother, inheriting secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women. She knew herbs to ease pain, techniques for turning breech babies, and prayers that gave strength to laboring mothers. But as she examined Margaret, Her weathered face grew grave. The other midwives prepared their instruments with grim efficiency. Knives for cutting the birth cord, but also for procedures too horrible to contemplate. Hooks and forceps for extracting dead children, potions to strengthen weak mothers, and holy relics to call upon divine intervention. The chamber filled with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender for calming, rosemary for strength, and other plants known only to the women who tended births and deaths. For 18 hours, Margaret labored in agony that defied description. Her screams echoed off the stone walls until her voice gave out, leaving only gasping animal sounds of suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood as they tried to save both mother and child. Dame Gwenllian used every technique in her arsenal: massage, positioning changes, herbal remedies, and constant encouragement whispered in Margaret's ear. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside, his boots clicking against the stone flags, each of Margaret's screams cutting through him like a blade. Servants hurried past with basins of hot water and armfuls of clean linen, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel, praying without ceasing for the young woman whose life hung by a thread. As dawn approached, Margaret's strength began to fail. She had been in labor for nearly a full day, her young body pushed far beyond its limits. Dr. Carleon, summoned from his uneasy sleep, examined her and spoke in urgent whispers with Dame Gwenllian. The baby was alive but in distress, its heartbeat irregular and weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her pulse thready, her skin pale as parchment. The decision was made to attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child at the cost of the mother's life. Dame Gwenllian had performed the technique before, but never on someone so young and small. She positioned Margaret carefully, praying silently to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth, as she prepared to reach inside the young woman's body to guide the baby into the world. When the baby finally emerged, torn from Margaret's body in a process that nearly killed her, the midwives held their breath. The infant was pale, barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For a terrifying moment, the chamber was silent except for Margaret's labored breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then Dame Gwenllian cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and a thin, angry wail filled the air, the sound that announced the arrival of Henry Tudor, future King of England. Margaret, barely conscious, her body shattered by the ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a haze of pain and exhaustion. She tried to reach for him, but her arms would not obey. Dame Gwenllian placed the baby on Margaret's chest for a brief moment, the traditional first meeting between mother and child, before rushing him to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed the infant with desperate intensity, memorizing every detail of his tiny face. A shattered body, an unbroken spirit. The damage to Margaret's body was severe and permanent. Dr. Carleon, examining her in the days following the birth, found extensive tearing and internal injuries that would never fully heal. She would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had ended her childbearing, years before they had properly begun. At 13, she was effectively barren, her reproductive life sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. The physical recovery was agonizingly slow. For weeks, Margaret hovered between life and death, racked by fever and infection. Dr. Carleon applied every remedy in his arsenal bloodletting to balance her humors, herbal poultices to fight infection, and strong wines fortified with medicinal herbs to restore her strength. Dame Gwenllian never left her side, spooning broth between Margaret's cracked lips and monitoring every change in her condition. Margaret's psychological recovery was even more complex. The trauma manifested in nightmares that left her screaming in the night. She developed an intense fear of physical contact, flinching from even the gentlest touch. Her relationship with her newborn son was complicated by the association between his presence and her pain. She loved him desperately, but could barely tolerate holding him without being overwhelmed by memories of his violent birth. Yet, if Margaret's body was broken, her spirit remained unshattered. As she recovered slowly in the months following Henry's birth, she displayed an iron will and calculating intelligence that would make her one of the most powerful women in English history. She understood, even in her weakened state, that her son represented the future of the Lancastrian cause. She also knew that a landless widow with a baby son needed protection in a world sliding toward chaos. The Wars of the Roses and a mother's separation. The Wars of the Roses erupted with increasing violence. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans announced that England would settle its dynastic disputes with sword and axe. The White Rose of York faced the Red Rose of Lancaster in a conflict that would consume the nobility for 3 decades. Richard, Duke of York, claimed the throne through his descent from Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians held it through their descent from Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt. Margaret, with her Beaufort lineage, was automatically aligned with the losing Lancastrian cause. King Henry VI was widely regarded as weak, possibly insane, and incapable of effective rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was more capable but deeply hated, blamed for England's military disasters in France and the kingdom's slide towards civil war. Margaret's solution was marriage, again. In 1458, barely recovered from Henry's birth, she married Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The wedding was a quiet affair, unlike the pageantry of her marriage to Edmund Tudor. Margaret was still weak, still grieving, and her new husband was a stranger chosen for political utility. Stafford was a Yorkist sympathizer, but a pragmatist who understood that protecting Margaret meant protecting valuable Beaufort estates and bloodlines. For Margaret, the marriage offered safety for herself and her son, even if it meant sharing the bed with a man whose political loyalties opposed her own. The arrangement was more business partnership than romantic union, a practical solution to practical problems. The marriage contract, negotiated by Margaret's mother and Stafford's father, was extraordinarily detailed, reflecting the complex political situation. Margaret retained control of her Beaufort estates, ensuring her son's inheritance remained intact. Stafford provided military protection and political cover for the family's Lancastrian sympathies. Most importantly, young Henry Tudor remained under Jasper Tudor's guardianship in Wales, a provision that likely saved his life. The marriage to Stafford lasted 14 years through some of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. Margaret watched as kings rose and fell with stunning rapidity. Henry VI deposed, Edward IV crowned, Henry VI restored, Edward IV triumphant again. Each change brought new dangers for those with questionable loyalties or valuable bloodlines. Margaret learned to navigate these treacherous waters with increasing skill. She cultivated relationships with women from both sides of the conflict, understanding that female networks often proved more durable than male alliances. She corresponded with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's queen, while maintaining secret communications with Margaret of Anjou in her French exile. These relationships required extraordinary diplomatic skill. A single misplaced word could bring charges of treason. Throughout these years, Margaret's son Henry remained in Wales under Jasper Tudor's guardianship. The arrangement was practical but heartbreaking. Margaret saw her only child perhaps once or twice a year, under carefully negotiated conditions. Henry grew from infant to young man as a stranger to his mother, raised in the Welsh hills while she maneuvered through the treacherous currents of English court politics. The separation was necessary but agonizing. Margaret poured her maternal instincts into carefully coded letters that could pass through enemy lines without revealing dangerous information. She sent gifts when possible: books, clothes, small tokens to remind Henry of the mother he barely knew. Mostly, she lived in constant anxiety, never knowing if her son was safe, healthy, or alive. Henry's education in Wales was comprehensive and practical. Jasper ensured his nephew learned not just noble accomplishments writing, swordsmanship, music, and dance, but also the harder skills of survival. Henry learned to speak Welsh fluently, understand rural life, and command the loyalty of men who owed him nothing but respect. These lessons would prove invaluable when he returned to claim his throne. Margaret's own education continued through her marriage to Stafford. She learned to manage vast estates, read financial accounts, and understand the complex web of obligations that bound medieval society. She studied law, history, and theology with the intensity of a university scholar. Her library became one of the finest private collections in England, filled with works in Latin, French, and English on subjects from military strategy to mystical theology. The tide turns. In 1461, everything changed again. Edward IV won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest engagement ever fought on English soil. On March 29, 1461, an estimated 50,000 men met on a snow-covered field in Yorkshire. By evening, nearly half were dead. The Lancastrian cause lay in ruins, its leadership scattered or dead. Henry VI fled to Scotland, while Margaret of Anjou sailed for France with her young son, Edward of Westminster. The aftermath of Towton created a dangerous situation for Margaret. Her Lancastrian blood made her suspect in Edward IV's eyes, but her marriage to Stafford provided some protection. More dangerously, her infant son in Wales represented a potential rallying point for Lancastrian resistance. Edward IV had already demonstrated his willingness to execute enemies. Would he extend that policy to children? Margaret spent sleepless nights wondering if soldiers would come for Henry. She developed an intelligence network, paying servants and merchants for news from Wales, bribing clerks for copies of royal correspondence, doing everything to stay ahead of potential threats. In 1469, Henry Stafford was wounded fighting for Edward IV at the Battle of Edgecote. The deep gash in his thigh became infected, leaving him partially disabled and bitter about his service to the Yorkist cause. He had risked his life for Edward IV and received little recognition. The disappointment made him receptive to Margaret's subtle influence. She nursed him through months of painful recovery, using the time to shift his political loyalties. She never directly advocated for the Lancastrian cause. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt about Edward IV's competence, shared stories of Yorkist corruption, and convinced Stafford that his service had been inadequately rewarded. By 1470, when the Earl of Warwick began his rebellion against Edward IV, Stafford was ready to switch sides. In 1470, the political kaleidoscope shifted again. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, fell out with Edward IV and allied with Margaret of Anjou to restore Henry VI. The alliance was bizarre. Warwick had originally put Edward IV on the throne and fought against Henry VI for years, but politics made strange bedfellows. Margaret watched with intense interest and growing hope. If Henry VI could be restored, perhaps her son could return from Welsh exile. She began reaching out to Lancastrian sympathizers, testing the waters for a potential uprising. The restoration of Henry VI in October 1470 seemed miraculous. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, while Henry VI was led from the Tower of London and restored to his throne. The poor, mad king seemed bewildered, unsure how he had gone from prisoner to monarch overnight. Margaret attended his restoration ceremony at Westminster, seeing for herself how feeble and confused the Lancastrian king had become. The restoration was short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile in March 1471 with Burgundian support and a small army of mercenaries. The decisive confrontation came at Barnet in April 1471, where Warwick was killed. 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, the Lancastrian cause died forever. The battle saw the death of Edward, Prince of Wales, the last direct heir to Henry VI's throne. His death, combined with the mysterious disappearance of Henry VI shortly afterward, ended the direct Lancastrian line. Suddenly, Margaret's teenage son became the most viable claimant to the Lancastrian succession, and one of the most dangerous people in England. Exile and ambition. Jasper Tudor, recognizing the immediate threat to Henry's life, made a desperate decision. He would take the boy into exile rather than risk capture and almost certain execution. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471, 14-year-old Henry Tudor boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed into 14 years of exile in Brittany. The departure was hurried and dangerous, with Yorkist forces closing in on the last Lancastrian strongholds in Wales. Margaret was not present for her son's departure, unaware until days later that her child had fled for his life. When the news reached her, the shock was overwhelming. She had spent 14 years separated from Henry by the breadth of Wales. Now they were separated by the English Channel and the hostility of nations. Margaret returned to England and her marriage to Henry Stafford, with a heart hardened into something stronger than steel. If she could not be a mother in the traditional sense, she would become a strategist, a survivor, a woman who would dedicate her life to putting her exiled son on the throne. The grief of separation transformed into cold, calculating ambition. Courtiers who had known Margaret as a quiet, pious young woman suddenly encountered a formidable political operator who seemed to see 3 moves ahead in every situation. She began building networks of support, identifying nobles who might be persuaded to back her son's return. Henry Stafford died in 1471, shortly after Henry's exile began. The timing was suspicious to some. Stafford had been in poor health since his war wound, but his death came at a convenient moment for Margaret's maneuvering. Whether natural causes, poison, or stress killed him remains unclear, but his death freed Margaret to pursue her ambitions openly. Now approaching 30 and twice widowed, Margaret faced a crucial decision about her third marriage. She could have chosen safety, marrying a minor noble who would protect her estates and leave her to grieve. Instead, she chose power. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of England's most politically adept nobles. Stanley was a master of backing the winning side at the last moment, switching loyalties with perfect timing. His family controlled significant military forces in northwest England, and his connections reached every level of society. For Margaret, alliance with Stanley meant access to intelligence networks, political influence, and military resources. For Stanley, marriage to Margaret brought the prestige of Beaufort blood and connections throughout the nobility. The wedding ceremony was elaborate, designed to announce Margaret's continuing importance despite her son's exile. The festivities lasted 3 days, with tournaments, banquets, and religious services drawing nobles from across England. Edward IV himself attended, perhaps recognizing that it was better to have the dangerous Margaret Beaufort where he could watch her. The marriage arrangement was complex. Margaret retained control of her Beaufort estates and the right to pursue her son's interests. Stanley gained a wife whose intelligence complemented his political skills. Together, they navigated the dangerous final years of Edward IV's reign, surviving purges and upheavals that destroyed many contemporaries. A mother's intelligence network. In Brittany, Henry Tudor grew into manhood in exile. The Duchy of Brittany was technically independent, but caught between France and England. Henry's position was precarious. He was valuable as a potential ally, or bargaining chip, but dangerous as a focus for opposition to Edward IV. Letters between mother and son became infrequent and carefully coded, using false names and elaborate ciphers hidden in innocent correspondence about trade or family matters. Margaret lived with constant fear that her son was dead, killed by assassins, or claimed by disease. She developed an extraordinary intelligence network, with informants in royal palaces, merchant guilds, monastic houses, and noble households across England and the continent. Information flowed to her through secret communications that would have impressed professional spy masters. She knew about troop movements before some commanders, heard court gossip before it reached the king's ears, and monitored the health and loyalties of potential allies and enemies. Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, to inherit the throne. The king's sudden death at age 40 threw the kingdom into crisis. A child king required a regency that could easily become a dictatorship, but Edward V would never be crowned. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a coup, and young Edward V and his brother Richard disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen alive again. Richard III was crowned in July 1483, but his reign began under a cloud of suspicion. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation represented both danger and opportunity. His seizure of power destroyed Yorkist legitimacy, making Henry Tudor's distant claim through the Beaufort line a viable alternative to a king suspected of murdering children. Margaret began to plot with breathtaking audacity, working through Bishop John Morton and other exiles. She coordinated a rebellion within England while arranging for her son to invade from Brittany. The conspiracy required perfect timing, extensive financing, and communications across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The rebellion collapsed in October 1483 when betrayal exposed Henry's planned invasion. Margaret watched in horror as her co-conspirators were executed. She escaped death only because of her marriage to Stanley, but was placed under house arrest and stripped of her titles. Yet Margaret was not defeated. Even under arrest, she continued plotting through coded letters and trusted servants, planning not just her son's return, but his successful reign as king. The triumph of a mother's will. When Henry finally invaded at Milford Haven in August 1485, Margaret's patient cultivation of the Stanley family paid its ultimate dividend. At Bosworth Field on August 20, 1485, Richard III died fighting in the mud of Leicestershire. The Stanley forces, positioned to support Richard, turned on him in a betrayal Margaret had orchestrated through years of careful manipulation. Her son was crowned Henry VII, King of England. After 28 years of separation, 14 years of exile, and decades of patient planning, Margaret became the most powerful woman in England. But she never again enjoyed the simple relationship of mother and child, stolen from her by political necessity. Margaret lived to see her son establish the Tudor dynasty, marry Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, and father the prince who would become Henry VIII. She died in 1509, just days after Henry VIII's coronation, having completed an arc of ambition that began in the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle. The cost of her success cannot be calculated in simple terms. She sacrificed her body to give England a king, her motherhood to political necessity, her personal happiness to dynastic ambition. The 13-year-old girl screaming in labor at Pembroke Castle could never have imagined the woman she would become. The king's mother, the founder of a dynasty, the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses through maternal love transmuted into political gold. In Westminster Abbey, where Margaret Beaufort lies in her tomb of black marble, visitors can read the Latin inscription summarizing a life of extraordinary achievement built upon extraordinary sacrifice. But they cannot hear the echoes of that long-ago scream, the sound of a child in agony, bringing forth the future of England. That sound, and the story it began, remains buried in the stone walls of a Welsh castle, where the Atlantic waves still crash against the cliffs, and the wind still howls through the ancient stones, carrying whispers of a girl who became a queen mother through suffering no child should ever endure.